When my father died, he left me his debt-ridden business and a cryptic note. My mother insists we sell everything to pay off his creditors, but a hidden ledger shows the debts aren't his. They are hers, and she's been using his death to bankrupt me. The heavy brass key felt cold and jagged in my palm, a piece of metal that now represented everything my father had left behind. When I pushed open the door to his private office, a puff of stagnant air greeted me, carrying the ghostly scent of the cheap cigars he favored and the dregs of coffee left in a ceramic mug. It had been 3 weeks since the funeral, yet the room felt like a tomb that hadn't quite settled. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of afternoon light, settling over the mahogany desk where he had spent 40 years building a legacy that everyone now told me was a hollow shell. My chest felt tight as I stepped inside. Every corner of this room held a memory, the way he'd spin around in that squeaky leather chair to greet me, or the rhythmic tapping of his pen when he was deep in thought. Now the only sound was the unsettling silence of a dead business. I sat in his chair and the leather groaned under my weight, a sound so familiar it brought a lump to my throat. But the sentimentality evaporated the moment I looked at the desk surface. It wasn't covered in blueprints or new contracts. It was buried under a mountain of red ink. Thick, manila envelopes with "Final Notice" stamped across them in bold letters were fanned out like a losing hand of cards. I picked one up, my fingers trembling slightly. It was a utility shut-off notice for the warehouse. Another was a demand for payment from a supplier we had used for decades. It didn't make sense. Dad was a meticulous man, the kind who balanced his checkbook to the penny every Sunday night. How had he let it get this bad? The physical toll of the last few months began to settle in my bones, a deep aching exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. I felt like I was standing on the deck of a ship that had already slipped beneath the waves, and I was the only one left trying to bail out the ocean with a thimble. The heavy thud of the front door downstairs echoing through the floorboards told me I wasn't alone. A few moments later, the office door creaked open and my mother stood there. She looked fragile, her silver hair perfectly coiffed but her eyes rimmed with a redness that spoke of constant weeping. She held a lace handkerchief pressed to her lips, her shoulders trembling as she stepped toward me. "Oh, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You shouldn't be in here. It's too painful. It's all just ruins now." She walked over and placed a stack of legal documents on top of the overdue bills. They were liquidation papers, prepared with a speed that felt jarringly efficient. "We have to sign these today, honey," she urged, her voice gaining a desperate edge. She sat on the edge of the guest chair, leaning in until I could smell her floral perfume. "The bank called again this morning. Your father. He wasn't the man we thought he was. The gambling, the bad investments in those overseas schemes, he's left us with nothing but shame. If we don't sell the equipment and the land by the end of the month, the creditors will take the house too. We have to protect what's left of our name." I looked at her, searching for the strength I usually saw in her, but all I saw was a frantic need to erase everything Dad had built. She spoke of his secret life, with such conviction that I felt a flicker of doubt. Could I have been so blind to my own father's failings? She reached out and squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Sign them, Sarah. Let's just bury the debt with him and move on." I told her I needed more time to go through his personal effects, a request that made her mouth tighten into a thin, hard line before she recovered her grieving mask and left. Once the sound of her car faded down the driveway, I retreated to the back of the office, toward Dad's old workbench. He was a tinkerer at heart, and this was where he went when the world got too loud. I started packing his hand tools into a crate, but as I moved a heavy vise, I noticed a slight misalignment in the floorboards beneath. One plank didn't quite sit flush with the joist. Using a flathead screwdriver, I pried it up. Tucked into the dark hollow was a small rusted tin box, the kind that used to hold peppermint lozenges. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. There was no money inside. No jewelry. Just a single scrap of yellowed notepad paper with a message written in Dad's steady, architectural print. "The birds don't eat from the feeder they build. Watch the hands that feed you and follow the trail of the blue ink." The words were an enigma, a riddle from a man who knew he was being watched. I read it over and over until the ink blurred. "The birds don't eat from the feeder they build." He was talking about the business, the feeder. And if he wasn't the one eating from it, who was? The blue ink mention felt like a direct instruction. I went back to the main desk and pulled out the official company ledger, the one our family accountant saw every quarter. It was filled with standard black ink, typed entries and professional notations. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just a slow, steady decline into the red. But Dad's note hadn't been an accident. I stayed long after the sun went down, the only light in the building coming from the small green shaded lamp on the desk. I began searching the bookshelves, pulling down every volume until I reached a dusty leather-bound encyclopedia. When I opened it, the middle had been hollowed out. Nestled inside was a second ledger, identical in cover but far more worn. I opened it to the first page and my breath hitched. Here the entries were handwritten. Every page was a sea of vibrant royal blue ink. As I flipped through the months leading up to Dad's passing, a horrifying pattern emerged. The official ledger showed business losses, but this hidden book showed personal withdrawals. Massive sums of cash were being siphoned off every Tuesday and Thursday. The entries were signed with a flourish, a stylized capital letter that I initially thought was Dad's, H for Henry. But as I squinted at the loops and the pressure of the pen, I realized H was actually a G for Grace. My mother's name. The handwriting was a perfect, practiced imitation of Dad's, but the ink, that specific shade of blue, was the one she used for her bridge club invitations. A cold chill settled over me as a specific memory floated to the surface, sharp and jagged as broken glass. 3 years ago, at the height of what Mother called our first financial slump, she had come home draped in a floor-length mink coat. She had giggled like a schoolgirl, telling Dad and me that her distant Aunt Margaret had left it to her in a surprise will. Dad had smiled, though I remember now how tired he looked even back then. I quickly cross-referenced the date in the blue ink ledger. There was plain as day. On the very Tuesday she received that coat, a withdrawal of $12,000 had been made from the company's pension fund. It wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't a gift. It was stolen from the men and women who had worked for my father for 20 years. My mother hadn't been a victim of Dad's mismanagement. She was the architect of his ruin. She wasn't trying to save the family name. She was trying to burn the evidence before I could find it. I sat in the dark, the blue ink glowing like neon under the lamp, realizing that the woman I had comforted all afternoon was the predator my father had tried to warn me about. The ledger felt like a lead weight in my bag as I walked toward the local branch of the First National Bank the following morning. The glass doors hissed shut behind me, sealing out the morning bird song and leaving me in the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of a place that held all our family's darkest secrets. Mr. Henderson, a man who had played golf with my father for 30 years and watched me grow from a toddler into an adult, looked up from his desk with a somber smile. He adjusted his spectacles, his expression softening with that practiced sympathy people offer to the newly orphaned. I didn't want his pity, I wanted the truth. I sat down across from him, leaning forward until the edge of his mahogany desk pressed against my ribs. "I'm just trying to make sense of the estate, Arthur," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm in my chest. "I found a few entries that don't quite match the public filings." I slid the blue ink ledger across the desk. I watched his eyes track the handwritten lines, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound, and looked toward the door to ensure it was closed. "Sarah," he whispered, leaning in so close I could see the tremor in his hands. "I assumed you were aware. Your mother, she opened a private line of credit years ago. She presented the board with a power of attorney signed by your father. We had no reason to doubt her. She's used the warehouse and the main production plant as collateral for 3 separate personal loans. Huge sums, Sarah. I thought they were for your father's medical treatments in the city, but the funds were always moved to an offshore holding account within 24 hours. My heart hammered. He thought I knew. He thought I was part of the silence. I realized then that my father hadn't been a bad businessman. He had been a man stripped of his own authority while he was still drawing breath. I left the bank in a daze, the sun feeling too bright and the air too thin. I needed to see her. I needed to look into her eyes and see if there was a shred of the mother I thought I knew left inside. I invited her over for tea that Sunday, setting the table with the fine china she loved, the gold-rimmed cups that Dad had bought her for their 25th anniversary. When she arrived, she was draped in a silk scarf, her face a mask of weary tragedy. As she stirred 2 lumps of sugar into her tea, she launched into her usual script. The men from the collection agency called again, Sarah. They're so cruel. To think your father would leave us in such a position. It's heartless, truly. I watched her over the rim of my cup, my eyes tracing the lines of her face. It's strange, Mother, I said casually, letting a small silence hang between us. I was digging through some old files and found a debt I didn't expect. It seems there's a large outstanding balance at Miller's Fine Jewelry. Almost $40,000 for a custom diamond set. Do you know anything about that? I knew for a fact there was no such debt, but the reaction was instantaneous. Her eyes didn't fill with confusion or horror. They flashed with a predatory spark of pure, unadulterated greed. For a split second she looked like she was calculating the value of the diamonds. Then as quickly as a shutter closing, she squeezed her eyes shut and let out a soft, theatrical sob. Oh, that man. Even his vanities were funded by our ruin. I suppose we'll have to sell my engagement ring just to cover his lust for shiny things. The lie was so effortless it made my skin crawl. The following day I followed the trail of the blue ink even further, led by a small notation in the ledger that mentioned a firm called Riverside Developments. I found their office in a sleek modern building downtown. The developer, a man named Marcus Vane, didn't have the long-standing loyalty that Mr. Henderson did. He was a businessman who dealt in cold, hard facts. When I presented myself as the executor of the estate, he checked his records without hesitation. Your mother has been a very active client, Miss Thorne, he said, tapping a pen against a map of the county. She hasn't been paying off the business debts. Quite the opposite. Over the last 4 years she's purchased 6 prime lakefront parcels under her maiden name, Gertrude Miller. She's sitting on a small empire of real estate while the company's equipment is being auctioned off for scrap. The betrayal was total. She wasn't just bankrupting the business. She was building a life raft for herself while she pushed me and my father's legacy into the deep. I arranged to meet her at the old warehouse the next evening. It was a cold, cavernous space, filled with the silhouettes of dormant machinery that looked like huddling giants in the shadows. She arrived wrapped in her mink, clutching the liquidation papers like a shield. Let's just sign these and be done with it, Sarah. It's what your father would have wanted, to protect us from further embarrassment. I stood by the large bay window, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty floor. I found a note, Mother, I said softly, my back to her. Under the floorboards in the workshop. Dad left it for me. I turned around and saw her freeze. The practiced slump of her shoulders vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. He said to follow the trail of the blue ink. He mentioned the birds not eating from the feeder they build. For a heartbeat her composure shattered. Her lip curled and a look of pure coldness crossed her face, a look I had never seen in 25 years. Your father was losing his mind toward the end, Sarah, she snapped, her voice no longer trembling with grief but sharp as a razor. He was delusional, paranoid. He didn't know what he was saying. He would have told you anything to hide his own failures. That note is the rambling of a dying man who couldn't face the truth. She stepped closer, her eyes boring into mine. You're being emotional. Sign the papers so we can save what's left of our lives. But I wasn't listening to her voice anymore. I was listening to the memories she had tried to rewrite. I remembered the final months, how she had locked the bedroom door when the nurses came, how she insisted that visitors agitated him. I had been sidelined, told that my presence made his heart rate spike. I looked back at the hidden ledger in my mind, remembering a small crumpled receipt I had found tucked in the very back. It was from a law office 3 towns over, dated just 2 weeks before he died. He had dragged his failing body to a stranger's office to try and protect me because he couldn't trust the people in his own home. He knew she was siphoning the lifeblood out of the company. He knew she was waiting for him to slip away so she could finish the job. He had been a prisoner in his own house, and his only weapon was a scrap of paper and a bottle of blue ink. I looked at the woman standing before me, the woman who had held his hand while she emptied his pockets, and I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. The time for tea and polite questions was over. The silence that followed my mention of Dad's note in the warehouse was heavy, thick with the scent of old oil and the cold realization that my mother's mask wasn't just cracked, it was crumbling. But I didn't scream. I didn't let the white-hot rage boiling in my veins spill over into an unproductive argument. Instead, I let her think she had won that night. I lowered my eyes, mumbled something about being overwhelmed, and watched her walk to her car with the triumphant stride of a woman who thought she'd finally silenced the dead. The moment her taillights faded, the quiet Sarah she thought she knew disappeared. I spent the next 7 days living in a world of numbers and shadows. I sought out a forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Gable who specialized in finding money people tried very hard to hide. We holed up in a tiny rented office space far from the family business. Day after day, we cross-referenced the blue ink ledger with bank statements, tax returns, and the deeds I'd discovered at Riverside Developments. It was a clinical, sobering process. With every forged signature Mrs. Gable identified, I felt a layer of my childhood skin peeling away. I saw exactly how she'd done it, using Dad's declining health as a curtain to hide her stage play of theft. She had seen me not as a daughter to be protected, but as a convenient scapegoat, the person who would sign the final papers and take the fall for a bankrupt company while she slipped away to her lakefront properties. The cold, calm clarity that settled over me was terrifying. It was the feeling of a daughter realizing she was an orphan not because her father had died, but because her mother had never truly existed. By Friday we had a binder 3 inches thick filled with evidence of systematic fraud. I didn't call the police yet. I wanted a different kind of reckoning first. I sent out a series of invitations for a final settlement meeting at the office of Mr. Sterling, our family's estate attorney. I told Mother it was the day we would finally sign the liquidation papers and distribute the remaining assets. Her response was immediate and giddy, masked poorly by a text message about finally finding peace. When the day arrived, the atmosphere in Mr. Sterling's conference room was suffocating. 3 major creditors sat on one side of the long oak table, looking like vultures ready to pick the bones of my father's life. My mother arrived last, sweeping into the room in a charcoal gray suit and a wide-brimmed black hat that must have cost more than my monthly mortgage. She looked radiant for a grieving widow, her eyes scanning the room for the checkbook she expected to see on the table. She sat next to me, patting my hand with a gloved palm. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah," she whispered, her voice a soft purr. "It's time to let go of the past." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, looking at me to begin the proceedings. I stood up, but I didn't reach for the liquidation papers. Instead, I pulled the blue ink ledger and the forensic report from my briefcase. "We aren't here to discuss the bankruptcy of Thorne Manufacturing," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "We are here to discuss the personal liabilities of Gertrude Thorne." The confusion on the creditors' faces turned to sharp interest as I began to lay the documents out like a trail of breadcrumbs. I walked them through the private accounts, the forged power of attorney, and the siphoning of the pension fund. I showed the bank records Mr. Henderson had provided, linked directly to the purchase of the lakefront lots. "The debts you are seeking to collect were not incurred by the business for operations," I explained, looking directly at the lead creditor. "They were secured through fraudulent misrepresentation of my father's signature while he was incapacitated. These are personal debts, hidden behind a corporate veil that has just been pierced." The shift in the room was tectonic. The creditors leaned away from the table, their eyes moving from the documents to my mother. The color didn't just leave her face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving her looking old and haggard beneath that expensive hat. Mr. Sterling, catching the gravity of the situation, leaned over the ledger. "If these signatures are forged, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "you aren't looking at a liquidation. You're looking at a criminal investigation for bank fraud. And more importantly for those present, the collateral you used, the warehouse and the plant, cannot be seized because the loans themselves are invalid. However, your personal assets, including those new properties, are now fair game for recovery." Mother's reaction was a frantic, ugly pivot. She stood up, knocking her chair back against the wall. "This is a lie," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's always been jealous. She's a bitter, ungrateful girl who's making up stories because she can't handle that her father was a failure. This ledger, is a forgery she created. Arthur, tell them Sarah is imagining things." But Mr. Sterling only looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional coldness. I didn't argue. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the small scrap of yellow paper. Dad's note. I read it aloud, my voice steady and clear. "Watch the hands that feed you and follow the trail of the blue ink." The sound of his voice in the room seemed to deflate her entirely. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time she couldn't find a lie big enough to cover the truth. The creditors didn't wait for her to recover. They were businessmen and they smelled blood. They realized that instead of fighting over a bankrupt factory, they could go after the millions of dollars in real estate she had tucked away. They stood up as one, their lawyers already whispering about liens and freezing accounts. They didn't even look at me as they filed out. Their focus entirely shifted to the woman now sobbing silently into her lace handkerchief. She had tried to leave me with nothing, and in doing so she had ensured she would lose everything herself. Months later, the dust has finally settled. The warehouse is busy again, the sound of machinery a steady heartbeat that reminds me the business is alive. It wasn't easy. I had to sell the lakefront parcels mother had tried to hide, using every penny to pay back the pension fund and the legitimate suppliers Dad had always respected. I didn't keep a cent of the stolen wealth, but I kept the company. I walked into Dad's office this morning and the air felt different. The smell of stale cigars is gone, replaced by the scent of fresh wax and open windows. The mountain of red notices has been replaced by a neat stack of orders and a modest, sustainable budget. I sat in his leather chair, which doesn't feel like a sinking ship anymore. It feels like a throne I've earned. I took a small silver frame and placed it on the corner of the desk. In it is a photo of Dad taken years ago when the business was first starting to thrive. He's smiling, his eyes bright with the pride of a builder. I haven't spoken to my mother since the day at the lawyer's office. She's living in a small apartment now, her empire of secrets dismantled to pay for her choices. It's a quiet, lonely ending for a woman who wanted so much, but as I look at Dad's smile, I realize I haven't lost a family. I've regained my father's honor and found a strength in myself I never knew I possessed. I picked up a pen, one with black ink, and signed the first payroll check of the new era. I am no longer an inheritance of debt. I am the architect of my own future.